way we could start this off is, what is RxJS? The real answer might be kind of in how you use it. But let's talk about some of the things that I've heard other people say about RxJS over the last couple of years, which is, RxJS is hard. What is RxJS? RxJS is hard. I hear this a lot from a lot of people who are just getting started off with RxJS. It's okay. It's okay to think that it's hard. I thought it was hard too once. That's just for streaming data, right? It's a common misconception. It's often used for streaming data, but that's not it. Let's see. RxJS is great if I want to make a stock ticker or something. Every single example that a lot of the examples I've given, and every single example for years has been like a stock ticker, or the other one is a look-ahead search. What if I want to do something more complicated than a look-ahead search? Like, how do I even do that with RxJS? That's a common thing. I'm not actually attributing these to anything. Jeff Cross's beard does not talk. He does have a Twitter account, but Jeff Cross is a former member of the Angular team. Let's see. My name is Ben Lesh. I am a software engineer at Google. I work on the Alkali team. That's what this logo is here. It's an internal team at Google that works on internal tooling that works with Angular and RxJS. I don't work on RxJS at my day job. It's an open source project I work on at night, like Batman, except for way less cool. And I used to work at Netflix. So at Netflix, I actually worked with React and Node and Ember with RxJS. So I've got the Angular and React and Node and Ember and those sorts of things. If anyone wants to ask me questions about other frameworks with RxJS afterwards or on Twitter or whatever, happy to answer those questions. I have some experience there. This talk, I'm going to try to focus with Angular mostly because the example I have is in Angular. But other things, like I said, I'm the RxJS 5 and up project lead. I am not the creator of RxJS. That's a guy named Matt Pawłowski who works at Microsoft. RxJS has been around for 9-ish years or something, a pretty long time. You can find me on Twitter at Ben Lesh. If you have questions about RxJS or you need help with something, you can actually reach out to me, and I will try to answer everybody's questions if I can. If there are questions about how to do something in particular, I would recommend Stack Overflow or something most of the time, because then other people might get answers that answer the same question you're asking. But yeah, I do try to help everybody out I can or answer questions. So here's the evolution of things I've said about RxJS. Day one, I was like, what the hell is this thing? It looks like another Lodash. Why do I need another Lodash? This is weird. Then eventually I was like, well, they're kind of like promises, but with more than one value. OK. It's one way to think about it. It's not totally inaccurate. And then I kind of evolved, and I was like, no, it's more about observables. And observables are an async type. Promises are an async type. That's actually not totally true. Observables aren't always async. Then I would call it Lodash for async. Lodash, for those of you who are familiar, is a library for dealing with iterable sets and arrays. And you've got a lot of different functions. You can zip them and map them and do all these different combinators with arrays synchronously. So then I moved on and said, well, observables, which are concurrency primitive, and that's just confusing everybody. That's not really helping the situation when you explain it. And now I kind of just land on their observables, which are just push-based sets. So it's about pushing values at you. So RxJS is often used to deal with asynchrony. Common sources of asynchrony in web development you'll find are things like DOM events, AJAX, WebSockets, animations, those sorts of things. Server-sent events, which are a lot like WebSockets, just push values at you. And this is not an exhaustive list. I mean, there's a whole mess of different things, web speech APIs and things like that you have to deal with in web development these days. But RxJS is not just about asynchrony. It's about pushing values, like I said. So synchronous things you can deal with in RxJS. Single values, so strings and numbers and those sorts of things. Arrays. So you could loop over an array and push values out if you wanted. You can deal with things like iterables, so anything like a generator function, or strings are iterable if you want to use a string in that manner. Pretty much anything you can pass to or return from a function, you could deal with have observables emit, either synchronously or asynchronously. So I'm going to get into this talk, and this talk is going to, I want to do some more advanced stuff, show some cool things that you can do with RxJS. If you don't have a lot of experience with RxJS, you're going to be like, whoa, this is crazy. I'm not worried about you learning how to do everything during the confines of 45-minute talk, right? Like that's a little silly. What I want to do is hopefully get you excited about some of the things it can do and maybe provide some additional tools for people to use that already have some experience with RxJS, that sort of thing. But so a few of you that are not using RxJS already or don't know quite what it is might be missing some context, like what are observables? How do you subscribe and unsubscribe to observables, or how do you get values out of them? And what are operators? I'm going to talk a lot about these particular things, so I'm going to go over those really quick. This is just a quick summary. So observables, what I want you to do is I want you to think of an observable as a function that's shaped a lot like this. So I've got this function that I've named an observable, and you're passing an observer object to it. And the observer object is just an object that's got a next, error, and complete method to it. So in order to execute this function, I call it like any other function, and I pass this object to it. And inside of that function, I call next, I call complete. I call next 3 times in this case, and then I call complete to notify that the observable is done pushing values. But there's a problem with implementing observables as a function. You know, why not just have, why do we need RxJS? Why do we need an observable type if this is all an observable is? Well, the problem is pretty simple. What happens if I next after I say it's completed, right? I'm saying, here's all the values, I'm done. Wait, no, just kidding, here's another value, right? That's not good. We don't want to do that. And in this scenario, this would totally still next another value at you. So we need to provide some sort of guarantees. So in order to provide these guarantees, we wrap it in a class. And inside of the inner workings of that class, it's still just us calling this function. But we're going to call this function when we call subscribe on an instance of this class. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the observer object that you've given us, or the 3 callbacks that you've given us, and wrap them in an observer object. And we're going to wrap them in a safer observer object that doesn't allow you to next after you complete, or at the very least won't send that next along. So that looks like this. So now this is the shape of the observable that you would see in RxJS. There's one more thing about observables that's worth noting. They can tear things down. So if this function does something like set up some resource, in this case it's setting up a timeout, you can actually have this function tear down that timeout with this handy-dandy unsubscribe call it returns to you. So you can say, hey, go ahead and start doing this work, and then later on you can notify, I don't care about you doing this work anymore, I want you to stop and tear down. This gives us something really nice, which is called deterministic memory management, which means if I wrap an event listener or something in this, and in my teardown I remove the event listener, I'm guaranteed that when I unsubscribe, or when it completes or when it errors, it's going to call that teardown logic, and it's going to make sure my event listeners are removed, or my set timeout's cleared, or my WebSocket's closed, or whatever. So observables are basically functions. They don't do anything until you subscribe to them. They tie an observer to some data producer. They push values out via this observer object. And they can set up the data producer, whatever that is. Could be a loop over an array. Could be, like I said, a WebSocket or any sort of event of any sort. And it can also tear down that data producer via this subscription contract. But in more small summary terms, observables are just sets of values over time. So they're sets of events. And because they're sets, they can be transformed. So all sets can be transformed. So here I've got an observable, and I'm using these operators, filter, map, concat, map again, combining different observables together, mapping and filtering. You don't really need to know exactly what this does, but you can kind of look at it and maybe guess. These are pretty simple things. What we're doing is we're filtering observable down to a new observable, and then we filter that observable down to a new observable, or we map it to a new observable. And then we concat that. As soon as that one completes, we're going to concatenate another observable onto the end of that. That returns an observable, and so on and so forth. So we're transforming sets. And this might look more familiar if I used arrays instead, right? So you can all see that there's not much of a difference between doing this with an observable and doing this with an array, right? So in this case, we're filtering the array to a new array. We're mapping it to a new array. We're concatenating that to another array and get a new array back, and then we're for eaching over it, right? It's the same sort of thing. And the reason it works like this is because they're both sets or collections of things. I've got more on the basics of RxJS and the inner workings in these things in this particular talk. It's linked in this. When I put the slides up, you'll be able to go watch that. I don't want to hover so much on the academics of observables. I really kind of want to show you what they can do. So I'm going to go through an example. And this is more a 300 level talk instead of 101. But you can see some cool things in this, I hope. So what we're gonna do is I have this simple newsfeed app that's written in Angular. And all it does is it just gets a list of data via an AJAX request and displays it. That's all it does right now. But I want to add two features to it. The first feature I want to add is, well, how about we just poll this so every now and then it refreshes the news feed. Let's just go get the data on an interval of some sort and display it. And then the second feature I want to add is a pull down to refresh. So I don't know how many of you use Twitter or other mobile apps where you take your finger, you swipe down, and when you let go, if you let go past the right point, it loads new data. If you let go above that point, it does not load new data. It's a fairly common feature in web apps now. It's also pretty complex to add. So the basic app structure as it stands, and again, apologies to you, those of you that don't use Angular, but this would be pretty similar even in React, honestly, is we have a component for our latest news, which just lists out the latest news and does the job of going and getting this AJAX stuff. And then we have a news feed service, which gives us back the observable that does the AJAX request. So that gets used inside of our latest news component. So the latest news component in Angular land looks like this. I've got my component directive up there at the top. And it's just saying this class here is a component. Here's where you can find the template. Here's where you can find the style sheet. The selector is this, so that's how you know how to use it in other templates. This is all Angular idioms. But inside the class part is just a basic class. And it's got a property called news $. That's an observable. The $sign is just kind of to help us see what's an observable and what's not in this app. So news $sign is an observable of an AJAX request to get the news data. That's all it is right here, and we're getting that off of newsfeed service. And in my constructor, I'm injecting via Angular dependency injection our newsfeed service. But it's a pretty plain class as it stands. The latest news template looks like this. What's noteworthy in here, other than the other, get the ng4s for looping over things in Angular. The one thing that's kind of interesting in here is I'm using this pipe async idiom. This is Angular has first-class handling for observables, which is one of the reasons that I kind of like it. What this says is, hey, in the context of this ng4 at the top in that article tag, I want to subscribe to this news observable and bind to its values as they're outputting. And when it outputs a value, it's an array. I'm going to loop over that array and take the values from that and display them in here as my news. So this pipe async actually does the work for me of subscribing and even unsubscribing when the component's removed from the view. That's a nice thing that Angular adds. If you were going to do this in React or Ember or something else, you would have to have a component that did mount, and then you would subscribe, and then you would unsubscribe, and your component will unmount, or whatever the equivalent is in Ember. It's been a while since I've done this in Ember, but it's roughly the same thing. You can do the same thing in Angular also with onInit and onDestroy if you wanted to do it manually. The newsfeed service is a simple class. The annotation at the top is just to say that it's injectable for Angular purposes, but it's got a single method on it that is it's just getting the news. It's basically saying, here's an observable that's an AJAX request. I'm going to map it to get the JSON object off of it, and then I've got this error handling here that says, hey, if there's an error when I go to get this, I'm going to log it, and then I'm going to return empty, which is kind of a no-op. Just log that there was an error, but don't send the error down the chain and break anything else. I just wanted to know that there was an error in my AJAX request. So for purposes of this example, I actually have this little bit here. You don't have to worry about it. I essentially have kind of mocked the AJAX behavior, so I didn't have to write a whole server that actually gave me this stuff. But it's in there if you want to look at the slides afterwards. It's not a big deal. But at the end of the day, it's just kind of to mock the same behavior. And one of the interesting things about this is because observables can represent any value over any amount of time, so any shaped thing, if you want to mock an AJAX request, it's as simple as creating an observable that gives you an AJAX request. It's the same thing with promises, right? You can say, I expected a promise of this value, so I can return promise resolve some values, or I can actually build something that returns a promise that gives me those values. So let's add that update on an interval feature. So in order to do this, we're we'll go back to our latest news component. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another property, and I'm going to call it update news triggers. And this is just a property that it's going to be an observable that every time it fires, I want to have it somehow tell the news to update, tell it to go fetch via AJAX request another set of news. So what this observable timer thing means is it's saying, I want an observable back that will emit a value immediately at 0 milliseconds, and then every 300 or 3,000 milliseconds afterwards, so every 3 seconds afterwards. And it emits values 0, 1, 2, and so on. Not that we care about those numbers, but that's what it does. And what we're going to do is we're just going to say, OK, well, every time that emits a value, I'm going to switch map that into this AJAX request. And what that means is those values come in, I'm going to map it into a new observable, and then subscribe to that observable. And in the context of switch map, if there was a request already still sitting there waiting, it's just going to abort that previous request via unsubscribe and then subscribe to the new one it just got. So it's kind of creating another observable via a mapping function and then subscribing to it and pumping its values out through the resulting observable. So what this means is our news observable here that we had before, it still gives us a value right away because the timer says, here's a value right now at 0 milliseconds. Map it to an AJAX request, subscribe to it, send the AJAX request, get the values when those come back, and it'll go up and display them because I'm using that pipe async in my template. And then when the next value arrives, it'll do the same thing. So over and over and over again, we're feeding into this. So this is reactive programming. Each step is reacting to the notifications from the previous step. So here's what it looks like. I've set this to 3 seconds for visibility. I've got this video. And if you watch, you can see the times over there on the right-hand side kind of changed. And since this is generated news data that's obviously not very real, the rest of it doesn't look like it's changing that much. But how often? Hopefully news doesn't change every 3 seconds. News is horrible nowadays. But yeah, so this is trying to just so we can kind of see that, well, now, look, this is cool. This is updating. So this is things to notice about this. What we actually did here is we kind of worked our way backwards. We started with a situation where we had the minimal thing that we needed to display the news, which was we just made the AJAX request once. And then we're like, OK, well, we wanted to update in an interval. So then we made an interval and then had the interval kind of feed into the original news request, right, with the switch map to make it react to that interval. So let's get to the harder one, pull down to reload. This one is a lot more complicated. I just know that I'm going to spill this on my laptop halfway through the talk. I know that'll be exciting. So pull down to reload, the reason why it's complicated, if you think about all the things that this involves. So what we're saying is when the user touches and pulls down, so there's actually 2 events there. You've got a touch start, you've got touch movements, right? As they're touching and pull down, we want to show a marker next to where their finger is, roughly speaking, and it's got to move along with them, all right? So that's one part. If they move far enough in release, then we want to trigger a load and start animating that marker. If they don't move far enough and they let go, then we want to have that marker animate back to where it came from. And in the event that they are loading something and that spinner's going, when that load is finished, we want to then animate it back to where it came from. So there's a lot more involved with this. One thing I do know is pull-down events have this drag and drop sort of thing. And drag and drop is something I cover in a lot of the basic RxJS talks that I do because it's a kind of a simple way to show the power of being able to compose events as sets of things, right? So in a drag and drop scenario with either mouse or touch movements, it looks pretty much the same, where you get your touch starts and your touch moves and your touch ends. And what we're saying in this case is we're saying for every touch start event, I want to start taking all the touch movements until there's a touch end event. So that's what that line at the bottom is saying. Touch start, switch map that into touch moves and take those until touch ends. So this is going to give me an observable of touch events, but of touch movement events, but only while my finger's on the screen. So a the touch drag load to component, touch drag to load component. I don't know, I had a hard time saying that. We're going to have a component here that basically just controls the behavior of that marker, right? I don't want to add all of this to one component. That would get crazy. And it's going to fire an event, trigger an event to get the reload to occur. And it also has to be notified when the load is complete, so it knows when to stop animating that marker and send it back to where it belongs. I'm going to have a load notification service. And this load notification service is basically, its job is to be kind of an event bus between my two components, our latest news component and the touch drag to load component. What this is it's going to notify one direction for when a load is requested, and it's going to notify the other direction for when the load is complete, because these two components need to communicate with each other about that particular issue. So the basic architecture looks like this. The latest news component is actually going to use the drag down to load component. And to communicate between them for when I've requested a load event or when I've successfully loaded, I've got this load notification service. The load notification service is the easiest thing that we're writing here. So this is just a class with two properties on it that are both RxJS subjects. Now, an RxJS subject, for those of you who aren't familiar, are observables that are also observers. Now, observers are these objects where you have a next, an error, and complete method on them. In this case, subjects have a next, error, and complete method on them. And when you next into a subject, it sends that out to anyone who's subscribed to the subject as an observable. So it's kind of an observer and an observable on both ends. So this is just a way to communicate things through. And this subject actually is roughly the same shape, or at least the same functionality as the subject you would see in the observer pattern from the Gang of Four books, right? So that's what this subject is. We're going to have to refactor the latest news component again. So one of the things we're going to need to do is we're going to need to inject this load notification service. We're going to have to provide it. So that was the simple service I just showed you a minute ago, so we can use it. And we're going to use it in two spots. One, wherever we had this update news triggers that was just a timer before, but now I'm going to merge with this my request loads. So that's saying that every time request loads notifies me, or anytime the timer notifies me, send out a notification. And we know that update news triggers is what's notifying to get that AJAX request to get the news, right? So now if either one of these things fires an event, either the timer or a requested load over that subject, it's going to go in and get that AJAX request. The other thing we're going to do is I add this do statement down here. Now, do is for side effects. What do is saying is, hey, if I get a notification at this point, take that notification and send it along to an observer. In this case, the observer is our load complete subject. So anyone listening to load completes, which will be in the touch drag to load component, will be notified that, hey, I've got news data has come back successfully from my AJAX request. Here it is. And then the other thing about do is it doesn't actually alter the value. It still sends it along. So another word for do is tap. It's basically just tapping into this observable stream so you can see what's happening and then not affecting the value and sending it along down the observable chain. So our touch drag to load component, the template looks like this. The template's pretty simple. I've got a outermost div that's mostly for positioning, so we can kind of put our little marker at the top center there. So we're seeing absolute position top 0, it's at the top, left 50%. And then we've got an inner div to kind of move things over a little bit more and to deal with the vertical positioning of our marker when we're dragging. I'm moving it to the left by 35 pixels because I'm going to use a circle that's 70 pixels wide. So I'm centering that circle in the view. I've got this these bracket style transform. All this is doing is it's setting the transform on the style of this element every time an observable named position translate 3D $ emits a new value. It takes the value from that and sets it just like you'd set on the DOM element. If you had this div, you'd say div.style.transform equals some string. That's exactly what this is doing every time the observable emits a value because of that pipe async. We're doing a similar thing in the SVG below it, which is the SVG that contains our circle. And in this case, this one's called rotate transform. So this is the one we're going to use to kind of animate the circle to spin. All right, and so again, all it's doing is just setting the style on the DOM element whenever that observable emits. So this is an Angular thing. You can do the same thing in anybody's framework. It's just a little bit cleaner in Angular in this case. And then inside of that, I've got two circles. I've got a light gray circle that has a radius of 35, so that's our 70 pixel diameter circle. And then I've got a black circle that's kind of off-center from it so we can see it spin. Otherwise, spinning a circle that has nothing in it, and sure, it's animating, why not? So again, these are the two things I want you to notice in here is I've got these observables that I'm using to transform the styles, and we have to try to create those things. So we're gonna create them in here. I've got position translate 3D $, and I'm just gonna start off because I want to work my way backwards. I know that the end result of my observable should be something shaped like this. It's just an observable of a string that says translate 3D 000, right? And then the same thing for my rotate transforms. I know that I want to rotate 0 degrees just to start with. So this is just so we get it to render something. Let's just start with observable of. And this is observable of is just like, here's a value. This is observable of a value. It's not doing anything fancy to get the value, but it's got the right shape. So we're starting bare minimum. We're going to work our way backwards. The other thing we need to do is make sure we add our component to our latest news template, because I said we've got to use it there. Pretty straightforward. But let's look and see what it looks like. So I'm using the Chrome DevTools mobile preview to get the screenshot here. And you can see that, well, there's my component with my nice little round marker circle just hanging out at the top doing nothing, because that's exactly where I positioned it at zero movement so far. So let's start working our way backwards to do some of these things. I'm going to start with moving these positions. So it's easier to deal with numbers, right? If I'm going to move something around, I don't want to have to deal with strings all the time. So I'm going to have another property called positions, position $, that I use to actually create position translate 3D $, and I'm just going to do that with a mapping function. So this is still exactly the same thing we had before, but I've factored that into positions that is an observable of 0. And then position translate 3D comes from whatever observable positions is, and we're going to change that over time. But now we're going to map it to that string we expect. The other thing I'm going to do in here is I'm going to say, well, I also know that I don't want the whole circle to show up on the screen all the time. That's kind of annoying. We actually want it to be kind of off the top. So I'm adding this little -70 to get the circle to go off the top of the screen so it doesn't show up. And now let's use our drag and drop pattern. So this is the pattern I showed earlier, exactly the same pattern. I'm going to add it here in a property called drag. So I've got touch starts, touch ends, and touch moves, and all they are is just any event that's happened on the document. I'm getting that with the from event, which actually comes from RxJs. So that each one of these is observable of events, and I'm saying for every touch event, or touch start event, switch map that into touch move events, and then take those until there's a touch end. So that's a good start. So I'm having that off separate. But then I'm going to update my positions observable to actually use the drag events. So I'm just saying, OK, update my position every time there's a drag movement while I'm dragging, just to update that position. And that should then translate into updating that transform 3D Y position. And then I want to start that with 0, because that's our starting point. We want to start off the top of the screen. We don't want to wait for some event before we tell it where to position itself. So we're going to start with 0. But you notice 0's got a red squiggly on here because I'm using TypeScript. And it's saying, hold on, it's not happy. And it's not happy primarily because this is actually giving us an observable of touch events. So we need to scrub our observable of touch events into an observable of numbers. So we can start with 0 and then have positions updated. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a map in here, and I'm going to say, hey, for every, we'll take the start position, which is our touch start, and we'll get the page Y position of that, and get the difference between that and every single position we had while we were moving. So that's what I'm mapping to in here. So just some basic math. And now we have an observable of movement differences from the top of the screen while we're touching. So, but it's feeding into the position. So let's just see what we have in here and see if that's draggable. So right now, you see a mouse cursor there, but this is to mimic touching. you can see it's following the mouse. So we're getting somewhere. It's pretty good. We're part of the feature is done, right? But not all of it. So let's move on to the next step. Let's have it animate home back up to the top when we let go of it. Now, I'm going to be a little hand-wavy about this because we've got 45 minutes, and I don't want to get terribly in-depth about how the animations are created. I have an RxJS animations talk that I've linked here about that. But the essence of it is that I have an observable of animation frames. So every time an animation frame fires, the observable emits a value. And you get like differences in time and these sorts of things, and it enables me to create some tweening functions. So I have this Rx animations tween, and the basic rundown on this is that it's got a tween method. You give it a start value and an end value and a duration. And on animation frame, it'll give you numbers between the start and the end as they relate to that duration. Right? So hopefully everybody can kind of follow that. So this is a familiar concept to anybody who's used something like D3 or something like that. But basically we're saying tween from 1 to 10 and for a duration of 2 seconds, and we're saying at 0 milliseconds you're going to get a value of 1, and at 2 milliseconds or whatever it's going to be something greater than 1, and then when you get to 2 seconds you're going to have that value 10. It's just going to slowly increment its way there, and it's going to do the math to figure out what that's supposed to be. So let's get back to our code really quick. So this is what we were looking at. And we need to change this in some way so that when we get done with our drag and we let go, it says, oh, I'm going to move this back up. I'm going to animate this back up automatically to the top of the screen. So in order to do that, what we can do is we can concatenate another observable on the end of this. And concatenating an observable works like this. I have an observable. It plays until it's done. And when it's done, it says, oh, now I'll play the next observable. So if my one observable is an observable of drag and let go, and then it's done, as soon as I let go, it plays the next observable, which happens to be an observable of an animation. Even though they work together cleanly, even though they're doing two totally different things. So let's see, and more importantly, they both are observables of number, is what they're returning. So they both have the same shape in their output. So again, I'm concatenating on this tween, and I'm saying, oh, from whatever current position it's at, I want you to animate to 0, which is back up to the top, and I want you to do it over 200 milliseconds. So I have this position that I've gotten here, and the position is currently 0, and I need to update that in some way. I can use my do side effect to say, oh, every time I get a value emitted for what position this should be at, just go ahead and update that little piece of state that I need to know in order to get my animation to work. This is a little counter to what some people would try to do if they were being really pure about reactive programming, but it's totally fine to do something like this. It works, it's fine. And then down here, we've got a little problem, and the little problem is that tween function is being evaluated at the same time that entire switch map is being evaluated, which means it's being evaluated when the position, that POS variable, is still 0. So the tweening will always go from 0 to 0. It's not going to do anything yet. So we need to change this a little bit. And in order to change this a little bit, there's a tool in the RxJS Developers Toolkit called defer. And what this is it says, oh, give me a function that when you subscribe to it, executes another function that returns an observable, subscribe to that. So it's just kind of like it's delaying subscription, or it's delaying the creation of this observable until the point at which you subscribe. Little confusing, but it's a very, very powerful tool when you get into Rx and you hit a chicken or egg problem. Defer is your friend. So now this should work. Let's see. We touch, we drag down, we let go, and it animates back out. It's because we concatenated that animation back on the end. So that's pretty exciting. Let's get it to trigger the load now. That was the whole reason we wanted this feature. It's not just so people could play with a cool little animating thing on their screen, right? So what we can do here is we can use the do side effect one more time. So we know that our load notifications subject from our load notification service, we have this request loads subject that I said was going to ferry over to the other side where we're saying, hey, update the news values in our other component, right? That's already wired up. So what we need to do is we need to notify it that we're ready to load something. And so what we've got is I'll say, here's a side effect. Examine the position. If it's past half the window height, then notify that request load subject that you want to load something. And that should automatically notify the same logic in the other component that's actually loading the AJAX request. So that should trigger the AJAX request. But we don't want to spam that. We don't want to, for every single position as we're dragging past the window height, like request a new AJAX request. That gets crazy really fast. That's not what we want to do. So I'm going to add this little thing in here that says take while. So only take all of the values for the position values while we're actually above half the window height. There's a little problem with this, though. That means when you get past that distance, it's going to kill the whole observable. It's going to say, oh, I'm only taking these values while you're above this. As soon as you're past that, I'm done taking the values. I'm going to complete myself, and that's it. So what do you do? That's a crazy problem. It's like, oh, I wrote all this stuff. It's all perfect, but now it's killing itself every time I get past half the screen. How do I solve that? We have an operator called repeat. What repeat does is it says, hey, any observable that I'm operating on, when it completes, subscribe to it again and keep sending the values down. So it just kind of concatenates an observable onto the end of itself infinitely. So now our take while problem is gone. Let's see. So we've got it, and we see it load. So you just pull it down, and you see it change. Boop, it loaded something. But it needs to leave after it's done loading. And we've kind of circumvented that route. We've prevented it from leaving whenever we let go, because we haven't let go when we hit that halfway down the screen. It started to load, right? So it never completes that let go, and it never gets to concatenate on that animation to send it out. So we need to send it out whenever the load is complete, but we don't quite know when that load is complete. So I'm going to add another property on here, and it's just called complete animations. So the complete animation is just going to animate from whatever the current position is back. And I'm not doing anything with this quite yet, but I know that whenever I complete, I want to get whatever the current position is, wherever that may be, and send it back to 0 in 200 milliseconds. And I already have this positions observable, and this positions observable is notifying me where I want my little circle to be on the screen, right? So, and it's all coming from drags right now. So what I want to do is I want to merge complete animations in with that. So when either one of those two things gives me a value, it repositions my cursor. So the complete animation will send this up, but now they're going to be competing with each other. So we need to fix this a little bit still. So working backwards, current position needs to come from somewhere. So where can we get the current position from? Well, right here we've got an observable of all the positions, but complete animations is it's actually using complete animations. Well, we can still get all those positions from there, but now they're kind of looking at each other, and you can see TypeScript doesn't even like this, because what I'm doing is I'm saying, oh, positions actually is derived in part from complete animations, which is derived in part from positions. So chicken or egg problem, guess what the solution for that's going to be, right? The solution for that is observable defer. That actually solves our problem. So then whenever this is subscribed to, positions already exists, everybody's happy, everybody's fine. So we just wrapped this positions in an observable defer to solve that problem. But we don't want the animation, this animation to go and fire on every single position update. That's not quite what we want. So we've got our load completes subject from our service again, that event bus that's telling us, hey, the load was completed over here. I'm notifying you that you can stop animation and send it back to where it needs to go. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that, and I'm going to use with latest from. And what with latest from does is say, oh, every time I get a load notification completion, give me the latest value that came from positions. Just cache that one value all the time and give me the latest value from that. And then we're going to switch map that into our tween. So that's going to play our animation. So again, load completes notified, get the latest position, and pass that position into our tween so we get that animation from the current position back to 0. I skipped ahead a little. So yeah, that's essentially what we're working on here. So let's see if it's working. So we get the load, boom. So as soon as that load comes in, it animates back. So we've accomplished that feature. But we still don't have that handy-dandy spinning feature. Everybody likes when the loading thing spins, right? Like, that's important. I know I wouldn't use an app where it didn't spin. So let's start working with that rotate transform. It's just been sitting there at 0 degrees, doing nothing, not very exciting. We know we want to work with numbers. So let's move rotate transforms off to a rotate property here that's just an observable of 0. This is functionally the same. We're just mapping it to the same string in the other one. And then, OK, well, we can make it rotate all the time, just by using that animations tween. So now I've got, well, that's really just going to animate it over half of a second, like 360 degrees. It's just going to go around once and stop. And we want it to keep doing that over and over again while it's loading. So we use our friend repeat. And that's just going to play that animation back to back over and over again. OK? So let's see. So as we're pulling now, look, it spins all the time. It's not quite what we want is for it to spin all the time, but it is exciting that it's spinning all the time, I think. So we're going to use our request load notification that we are already using elsewhere to request the actual load and for the update news. And I'm going to switch map that into the animation. So that's saying, hey, when somebody notifies they want a load to start, then start spinning this. Okay? But then it's just going to spin forever after that. So we don't want that to happen. We want it to stop eventually. But oh, look, we have a notification for when load's complete. So we'll use our friend take until again. And when load completion fires, we're going to stop the animation. Then the final thing I want to do here is I'm going to just concatenate on an observable of 0, just the value 0 at the end. So that way it doesn't stop at some weird cockeyed angle. Whenever it's done, it snaps back to its original position of 0. So let's have a look. So we've got the spin, and then as soon as the load stops, there we go. So that's our whole feature. We added that entire feature. Well, I didn't actually type it up here, but 30 minutes to go over it. Obviously, the things about RxJS is that there's this whole language and all of these operators it's built on top of. And that's where it gets difficult, is learning how these operators work and kind of the reactive paradigm. But if I gave you advice on how to build these reactive things, I always say start simple and stub in the simplest possible thing. You saw me start with just an observable of some string value, right? And then kind of work my way back from there. This is one of the hardest examples I can think of off the top of my head. I don't expect everyone that's never used Rx before to walk out of here and be like, yeah, I know how to implement that now. That wasn't the point. The point was to show you what you can do with this fairly powerful set of primitives. You want to work backwards. Again, start with the simplest possible thing and figure out, OK, well, what events are firing that are going to give me the values I need or notify when I need to change this and try to build towards those and scrub those bits of data into the thing that you want, into what you need. Tool for people that have been using Rx for a little while, that it's not used enough, I think, in my opinion. I see people hack around it, is observable defer. If you have a chicken or egg problem with, oh, this observable needs some value at a specific time when you subscribe, or you need to know the state of something at the moment you subscribe and then subscribe to an observable, observable defer. The drag pattern, this gets shown a lot in Rx talks. It's touch start, switch mapped into touch movements, take until, touch end. Same thing with if you're doing it with a mouse. It would be mouse down, switch mapped into mouse movements, take until, mouse out, mouse up. So these things are other things that you consider is take and take until and take while. These can be chained and nested. You can have a take until and then a take until right after that. And whichever one of those wins, right? Like you can have more than one. You don't have to do it all in one set, or a take while and that sort of thing. You can have more than one. For some reason, people always think, oh, take until, that's the end of the line. And it's like, no, that's just testing to see if you want this condition to stop your observable. You can have another one right after. And then another trick is take while complete. I've helped people in the past where they had an observable, and they had everything set up great, and they have this, well, I just need to take these until a certain point, but then I want it to start and do it again, and for some reason, they fail to remember that there's a repeat in there. Repeat will just resubscribe to the same observable and start the whole process over again. So again, I'm Ben Lesh. I run workshops in RxJS. You can find information about that at rxworkshop.com. That's all I've got for this talk. I'm open to questions. How much time do we have? Out of time. Sorry. No, you can grab me in the hallway, or again, you can reach me on Twitter if you have any questions. So thank you, everybody.